I worked the night shift at a gas station on a lonely highway in Brazil. Most nights are quiet, with only a few truckers and late-night travelers stopping by. It's a predictable routine until the night that made me question if this job was worth the risk. It was around 2 a.m. when a car pulled up to the pump. The driver, a thin man in his 40s, stepped out slowly, pausing for a moment before heading toward the store. He wore a dark hoodie, the hood pulled forward just enough to shadow most of his face. Something about the way he moved felt off. He entered the store and approached the counter. His voice was low, hesitant. He claimed that his car had broken down just a little past the station and that he needed a bit of gas to get to the nearest town. His story seemed rehearsed, like he had practiced the words beforehand. I glanced outside, and sure enough, there was a car parked just beyond the entrance to the highway. But something made my blood turn cold. The back door was slightly open, and inside, a dark figure sat motionless, as if hiding. A chill crawled up my spine. I had worked at this gas station for nearly a year and had encountered all kinds of customers, drunk travelers, impatient drivers, even a few troublemakers. But this was different. There was something calculated about his demeanor, like he was waiting for something. I forced a polite smile, nodding as if I believed him. "Sure, let me grab a gas can from the back," I said. But instead of going for the gas, I rushed to the emergency button beneath the counter, which alerted the local police. Almost instantly, the station's alarm blared through the night. The man flinched, but didn't react the way I expected. He smiled. Not an embarrassed smile, not an angry one, just a slow, knowing grin. Like he knew I had barely escaped something horrible. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store. I looked back at the car outside. The back door was now shut, and the vehicle was slowly rolling away, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived minutes later, but there was nothing they could do. No crime had technically been committed. The next day, I heard that another gas station a few kilometers away had reported an attempted robbery with a suspect matching the same description. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I had stepped outside that night. But the nightmare wasn't over. 2 nights later, as I went about my shift, I noticed something strange. A car was parked across the road, its engine off, its headlights dark. It didn't pull into the station. At first, I thought maybe someone had stopped to rest, but as the minutes stretched into an hour, I knew something was wrong. I checked the security cameras. A shadowed figure sat inside, unmoving. I called my manager and told him about the car. He reassured me that it was probably nothing, but my gut told me otherwise. Then, the car door opened. A man stepped out. It was him. This time, he didn't enter the store. He simply stood outside, just a few meters from the glass doors, staring in. The dim lighting made it difficult to see his face, but I knew it was the same man. My pulse pounded in my ears. My hands were clammy as I pretended not to notice him, busying myself behind the counter. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back to the car. But instead of driving away, he climbed into the back seat and another person took the driver's seat. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I locked the store doors and called the police again. By the time they arrived, the car was gone. Later that night, my manager and I reviewed the security footage. What I saw made my stomach twist. Before the car had parked across the street, it had passed the station 3 separate times, slowing down each time it approached. The next night, I switched shifts with a coworker. I told him everything, but he just laughed, saying I was being paranoid. But at around 3 a.m., he called me in a panic. The car was back. I stayed on the phone as he watched the man step out again, just as before. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Another figure emerged from the cartaler, broader, dressed entirely in black. They both stood outside, just beyond the reach of the security cameras, as if they knew where the blind spots were. My coworker locked the doors just as I had done, but instead of walking away like before, they waited. For nearly half an hour, they stood in the darkness, motionless. Then, just as silently as they had arrived, they both climbed into the car and disappeared. The next day, we found deep scratches near the back entrance of the store, as if someone had tried, but failed, to pry it open. But the worst part? My coworker said that before the men left, one of them lifted his hand and ran his fingers across his throat like a silent warning. That was the last straw. I quit my job the next day. I still wonder who were those men. What did they really want? And most of all, how long had they been watching us before we even noticed? But there's something else. A week after I left, my coworker sent me a message with a blurry photo from the security cameras. The same car had come back. This time, it wasn't parked across the street. It was right next to the pumps. And when he checked the footage from the night before, he realized something that sent chills down my spine. The car had been there for hours, just sitting, waiting. And then, in the final seconds of the recording, the driver's seat was empty. I work as a night security guard in a commercial building downtown. The building has multiple floors, but at night it's completely empty. My job is simple: monitor the security cameras, do routine patrols, and make sure no one enters unauthorized. Most nights are dull, the kind where the biggest concern is whether I remembered to bring extra coffee. But one night changed everything. One night made me reconsider if I ever wanted to work alone in the dark again. It started around 2 a.m. As I flipped through the security feeds, I noticed something strange. A man was standing on the sidewalk, facing the building. At first, I thought he was waiting for a ride, maybe a lost pedestrian checking directions on his phone. But he wasn't on his phone. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. He never moved, never shifted his weight, never even looked away. A chill crept down my spine. Something about his stillness felt wrong. I zoomed in on the camera feed, but his face was obscured by shadows. Even with the zoom, I couldn't make out his features. Just the outline of a head, slightly tilted, as if he was watching me. I decided to step outside to see if he needed anything. Maybe he was a drunk or a homeless man looking for shelter. But the moment I opened the door, he was gone. I stepped out further, scanning the sidewalk. No one, not even footsteps leading away. I stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe he had walked off while I was switching camera angles. Maybe I had imagined how still he was. I shook it off and returned to the control room. But as I sat back down, an alert flashed across my screen. Movement detected on the 7th floor. I froze. I was the only person in the building. Swallowing my unease, I switched the feed to the 7th floor. The long, dimly lit hallway stretched out on the screen, eerily still. Then, at the far end of the hall, just barely out of the light's reach, a figure stood motionless. A static-like buzz filled my ears. I squinted at the screen, but the camera quality wasn't great. It could have been a coat rack or a misplaced chair, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight and took the elevator up, stepping cautiously onto the 7th floor. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights above only made it worse. The hallway stretched before me, empty. I swallowed hard and moved forward, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I reached the spot where I'd seen the figure on the camera. Nothing. But then the lights behind me flickered, and I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't words, just a sound, a breath against my ear that made my skin crawl. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway was empty. I was alone, or so I thought. Just as I turned back toward the elevator, I caught it in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting into one of the offices. A cold sweat broke over my skin. I forced myself to move, to step forward, to check. My rational mind told me it was just paranoia, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I reached the office door, my hand hovering over the handle. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room was empty. The only movement came from the blinds swaying slightly from the air conditioning. But the thing that made my stomach lurch was the chair at the desk. It was still spinning. I backed out, shutting the door quickly. Enough. I was calling the police. But as I reached for my radio, I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I bolted, sprinting down the hall, slamming the elevator button repeatedly. The doors slid open, and I threw myself inside, hammering the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I dared to glance up and froze. Standing at the end of the hall, half shrouded in darkness, was the figure. It didn't move. It didn't chase me. It only stood there watching, head slightly tilted as if amused. The elevator doors shut, and I held my breath the entire way down. When I got back to the security room, I switched all the cameras to the 7th floor. Nothing. No movement, no figure, no proof that anyone had been there at all. I quit the next morning. But the worst part? My replacement called me a week later, asking if I had ever seen something strange on the monitors. He said every night at exactly 3:07 a.m., the cameras on the 7th floor would glitch for a second. And when the feed returned, for just a fraction of a second, there would be someone standing in the hallway, watching, waiting, and each night they seemed a little closer. But last night, he told me something different. The figure wasn't just standing there anymore. It was facing the camera, and right before the feed cut to static, it smiled. I work as a night receptionist at a mid-sized hotel in Brazil. The job is uneventful most of the time, checking in late-night guests, answering phone calls, and keeping an eye on the security cameras. The building itself isn't particularly old or eerie, but something about working alone at night always put me on edge. Most nights, I try to distract myself, listening to soft music or scrolling through my phone between tasks. But this night was different. This was the night that made me reconsider ever working the night shift again. It was around 2:30 a.m. when he walked in. A tall man, sharply dressed in a dark suit, carrying nothing, no luggage, no briefcase, nothing. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached the counter. There was something about him that felt off. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. "I'd like a room for the night." I nodded and pulled up the booking system. "Of course, sir." "Do you have a reservation?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, but I assume you have rooms available?" His tone made it sound more like a statement than a question. Something in the way he looked at me made my stomach turn. I tried to ignore the discomfort and continued with the check-in process. "How many nights will you be staying?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just one, for now." I printed his key card and slid it across the counter. As he picked it up, he paused, his fingers hovering over the plastic. "You work alone here?" My stomach tightened. I forced a polite smile. "Oh no, my colleague is in the back office. He'll be out soon." That was a lie. I was completely alone. His smile didn't fade. He simply nodded and took his key. "Good. Have a pleasant night." I watched him step into the elevator, feeling a knot form in my gut as the doors slid shut. Something about him felt wrong. I shook it off and returned to my desk, trying to focus on my work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. At around 3:45 a.m., I glanced up at the security monitors. My breath caught in my throat. The screen showing the hallway outside his room flickered for a second, and when it returned, he was standing just outside his door. Not moving, not doing anything, just standing there, staring at the camera. I swallowed hard. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe ela tinha saído apenas para pegar fresco. Another 5 minutes passed. He hadn't moved. I reached for the hotel phone and dialed his room number. It rang once, twice. Then on the screen he moved. Not toward his room, not toward the elevator, toward the camera. I hung up the phone, my pulse hammering. He was walking slowly, deliberately, toward the camera, toward me. Then, just before reaching the end of the hall, he stopped. His head tilted slightly. Then, very slowly, he lifted his hand and waved. My hands trembled as I switched the feed, now looking at the elevator. He wasn't there. I checked the stairwell, empty. I cycled through every camera I could, my breathing ragged. He was gone. The phone rang. I jumped so hard that my chair nearly toppled over. With shaking fingers, I answered. Front desk. Silence. Then in a voice just above a whisper, I know you're alone. The line went dead. I couldn't breathe. I frantically pulled up the security feeds, looking for him, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no trace of where he had gone. Then, as I switched to the lobby camera, my heart nearly stopped. The front doors were wide open. I hadn't heard them open, and he was nowhere to be seen. I locked every entrance in the building and called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of the man anywhere. No name in the system, no record of him ever checking in. The security footage from earlier, corrupted. The police told me there was nothing they could do. I quit the next morning. But that wasn't the end. A week later, my replacement called me. His voice was barely a whisper. I think he's back. I felt the blood drain from my face. What do you mean? The cameras, he said. I saw someone in the hallway, just standing there. And then the phone rang. I could barely find my voice. Did he say anything? There was a long pause. He asked if I was alone. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. What did you say? I lied, he whispered. But I don't think he believed me. I swallowed hard. Did you check the lobby? Yeah, he breathed. The doors were wide open. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. The camera feed glitched before he disappeared, he continued. And for a split second, I saw something else. I barely found my voice. What? He hesitated. It wasn't just him in the hallway anymore. I waited, my breath caught in my throat. There was someone standing behind him.